confident black woman steps into a boardroom, her heart pounding with ambition, only to be met with laughter from the very people who could change her life. What happens when the ones who doubt you the most are forced to watch your rise? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and get ready for a story you won't forget. The hum of voices in the conference room quieted as Naomi Carter stepped inside. She adjusted the cuffs of her navy blue blazer, keeping her shoulders back and her chin high. It had taken years of sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights to get here, and now, standing before a panel of investors, she was ready. The long mahogany table stretched before her, filled with men in tailored suits, their Rolexes glinting under the soft glow of recessed lighting. At the head of the table sat Richard Dalton, the CEO of Dalton Enterprises, a venture capital giant known for investing in the next big thing, as long as it fit their mold. Naomi had no doubt her company belonged in that category. She placed her laptop on the sleek glass podium and cleared her throat. Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Naomi Carter, founder and CEO of InnoTech, a software company that's revolutionizing artificial intelligence in customer relations. She clicked the remote in her hand, bringing up the first slide of her presentation. A sleek, modern logo filled the screen, accompanied by a market analysis that showed exponential growth projections. I appreciate your time today, she continued, scanning the room. We are currently seeking a $5 million investment for a 15% equity stake, with projections that will... A chuckle cut through the air. Naomi's breath hitched. Her gaze snapped toward the source. Richard Dalton, his arms crossed over his chest, a smug smirk playing on his lips. The sound wasn't just amusement, it was dismissal. I'm sorry, Richard said, still chuckling as he leaned back in his chair. I just want to make sure I heard correctly. $5 million? For customer service software? Laughter rippled through the room, a few men exchanging amused glances. Naomi's fingers tightened around the remote, but she forced herself to remain composed. Yes, she replied, her voice steady. Our AI system doesn't just automate responses, it learns from real interactions, adapting to provide more intuitive and personalized customer engagement. Major companies are already showing interest, and... But let me guess, Richard interrupted, still grinning. You don't have any major clients yet, do you? Naomi hesitated, but only for a second. We have several mid-sized companies currently in our beta program, and we're in talks with... Beta, Richard repeated, nodding knowingly. He turned to the others. You see, gentlemen, this is why we need to be selective. We get so many pitches, and everyone thinks they've built the next Google. A few of the men chuckled again, but one or two shifted uncomfortably. Naomi took a deep breath. She'd dealt with this before. The condescending tones, the interruptions, the dismissive glances. But she hadn't come here to fold. She straightened her posture, stepping away from the podium and looking Richard directly in the eye. With all due respect, Mr. Dalton, Google started in a garage. Amazon was once an online bookstore, and Tesla? People laughed at the idea of electric cars becoming mainstream. She gestured toward her screen, where her financial projections were displayed. Every great company started with someone willing to take a risk. InnoTech isn't asking for charity, we're offering an opportunity. Richard's smirk faded slightly, but his amusement didn't. He tapped his fingers on the table, studying her like she was some novelty. Spoken like a true optimist. I'm a realist, Naomi corrected, stepping closer. And realism is knowing that the tech industry is evolving. AI is no longer the future, it's the now. Companies that don't innovate will get left behind. You have a chance to be part of something groundbreaking. Silence hung in the air. Then Richard sighed, shaking his head. Miss Carter, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't a good fit for us. The finality of his words sent a sharp sting through Naomi's chest, but she refused to let it show. Thank you for your time, she said coolly, closing her laptop with a deliberate calmness. She gathered her materials, her movements precise and controlled. As she turned to leave, Richard added, Just some advice. sometimes ambition should be tempered with realism. There's a difference between a dream and a viable business. Naomi paused at the door, gripping the handle. She glanced back, meeting his gaze one last time. "Good thing I'm not just a dreamer," she said. "I'm a doer." And with that, she walked out. The laughter from the room followed her down the hallway, but Naomi barely heard it. Her mind was already working. She had no intention of letting this moment define her. No, she was about to redefine everything. Naomi didn't waste time licking her wounds. She had been underestimated before, and she would be again. But every moment of doubt from someone else only fueled her resolve. She walked out of that boardroom, but she didn't walk away from her vision. Instead, she took the rejection and turned it into momentum. If Richard Dalton and his smug investors didn't believe in her, fine. They weren't the only people with money, and they certainly weren't the only ones looking for the next big thing. The next morning, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, her phone at her ear. "Yes, I understand, but what I'm offering is a scalable AI model that adapts to customer behavior in real time," she said, tapping her fingers against the wooden surface. "Yes, we're currently in beta, but our early testers are seeing a 47% increase in customer retention. That's nearly double the industry average." She listened, nodding, even though the person on the other end couldn't see her. "That's why I'm reaching out. You don't need to wait for the big firms to validate us. Be ahead of them. When we launch, those same investors will wish they had gotten in early." There was a pause, and then, "We're interested. Let's set up a meeting." Naomi exhaled slowly, a smile creeping onto her lips. "Excellent. I'll send over a deck and we can discuss terms later this week." She ended the call and immediately started crafting an email. One win at a time. By the end of the day, she had secured 3 meetings with mid-size firms looking to integrate AI into their customer service models. They didn't have the deep pockets of Dalton Enterprises, but they had something just as valuable: belief. Belief was currency. With each new call, each meeting, each product demo, Naomi refined her pitch. She adjusted her strategy, learning what resonated and what didn't. When someone asked a tough question, she didn't brush it off. She found the answer. When an investor hesitated, she didn't back down. She showed them why they couldn't afford to wait. Her team, once just a handful of dedicated programmers, grew. She hired sales reps, marketing specialists, and a COO to handle operations while she focused on securing funding. It wasn't easy. She burned through her savings, maxed out 2 credit cards, and pulled 16-hour days. But the traction was undeniable. One by one, clients signed on. Innotech wasn't just a startup anymore. It was a movement. By the end of the year, they had doubled their initial projections. Companies were seeing real results, customer satisfaction skyrocketing, with AI-driven support that felt almost human. Journalists started picking up the story, intrigued by the young black woman disrupting a space dominated by the same old names. Then came the call. Naomi was sitting in her office, a small but sleek space in downtown Chicago, when her assistant poked her head in. "You might want to take this one," she said, barely hiding her grin. Naomi raised an eyebrow and took the phone. "This is Naomi." A familiar voice came through the line. "Miss Carter, Richard Dalton here. Looks like you've been busy." Naomi leaned back in her chair, a smirk forming. "Oh, you know, just building an empire." Richard chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Seems that way. Listen, I think we might have been too quick to dismiss you. I'd love to set up a meeting." Naomi let the silence stretch. She imagined him, probably in his oversized office, flipping through the latest headlines about Innotech's success, realizing that the company he once laughed at was now a real contender. "I'm flattered, Richard," she finally said. "But as you know, we're in a much stronger position now. If you're looking to invest, I assume you're aware that our valuation has changed." A pause. Then, "I'm aware. We're willing to discuss terms. Naomi tapped a pen against her desk, considering. Let me check my schedule, she said, keeping her voice neutral. I'll have my assistant reach out. When she hung up, she sat back, exhaling through her nose. The same man who laughed in her face was now chasing her down. Oh, how the tables had turned. Naomi didn't rush. She let Richard Dalton wait. She knew how the game worked now. The power dynamics had shifted, and this time, she wasn't going to be the one sitting across the table hoping to be taken seriously. For 3 days, she ignored the follow-up emails from his office. His assistant left 2 voicemails. The tone shifted between polite and slightly impatient, asking when she'd be available for a meeting. On the 4th day, she responded. Her assistant sent over a time next week, Friday. No negotiating. If he wanted to meet, he'd meet on her terms. When Friday came, Naomi arrived at Dalton Enterprises 10 minutes late. Not because she wasn't punctual, but because she wanted to send a message. She strolled into the massive office, taking in the same boardroom where she had once stood, humiliated, as they laughed her out of the building. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Her COO, Marcus Bell, a sharp-dressed strategist who had helped scale the company, walked beside her. Her legal advisor, Lydia Chan, had a leather-bound notebook tucked under her arm, and her head of product, Jason Fields, carried a tablet showcasing the latest AI upgrades that had companies knocking down their door. Richard Dalton was already seated at the table when she walked in. He stood, forcing a smile, though his eyes flickered with something else. Unease. Naomi, he said, stretching out a hand. She took her time removing her coat before shaking it, her grip firm but brief. Richard. She sat at the head of the table, his usual seat. The other investors in the room, several of the same men who had laughed at her months ago, looked uncomfortable. Some cleared their throats. Others avoided eye contact. Richard, ever the seasoned businessman, leaned back in his chair, trying to appear relaxed. First off, congratulations, he said, clasping his hands together. You've done something truly impressive. Initech's growth has been remarkable. Naomi nodded, offering a polite but distant smile. Thank you. We had a clear vision from the start. Yes, well, vision is one thing, execution is another, and I have to say, you've exceeded expectations. She caught the subtle way he tried to frame it, like she had surprised him, like she had somehow defied the odds rather than built something undeniable through pure talent and hard work. She didn't let it rattle her. I appreciate that, she said smoothly. So, tell me, Richard, why am I here? Richard exhaled, shifting slightly. We're interested in discussing investment opportunities. We believe Dalton Enterprises could bring significant value to your company, especially as you prepare for the next stage of growth. Naomi exchanged a glance with Marcus, who remained silent but watchful. Jason, next to her, kept a neutral expression. Lydia was already taking notes. Interesting, Naomi said, tilting her head slightly, because if I remember correctly, this company wasn't a good fit for you when I first came here. Richard had the nerve to chuckle. Ah, yes, that was an oversight on our part. An oversight, she repeated, her voice sharp but calm. We didn't fully grasp the potential at the time, Richard admitted, but I can assure you that's not the case now. We'd love to get in before your next funding round. We're prepared to offer a substantial investment, and in return, we'd take an advisory role. Naomi held up a hand, cutting him off. Let me stop you right there, she said, leaning forward slightly. I don't need advisory roles. I don't need validation. What I need are investors who believed in us from the start, not ones who laughed us out of the room and only came running when they realized we were winning. The silence was thick. One of the older investors shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. I think what Richard is saying is that we see the potential for a strong partnership. Naomi turned to him, her expression unreadable. A partnership? Yes, the man continued. We can provide resources, connections. "We have connections," she interrupted. "We have resources. We have clients. And we didn't need Dalton Enterprises to get them." Richard inhaled deeply, trying to regain control. "Naomi, let's be honest. Growth requires capital, and while you've done an incredible job, there's only so far you can go without the right backing. We're talking about scaling globally, competing at a higher level." She studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "We're already scaling globally." Richard blinked. "We just closed a $25 million investment deal," she continued, tapping a single finger against the table for emphasis. "That's why I took my time getting back to you. I was busy securing a round with investors who saw the vision before it was convenient." The color in Richard's face changed ever so slightly. "And because of that," she added, "we don't need your money. We don't need your partnership. We don't need you at all." Richard's jaw tightened. The other men in the room sat in stunned silence. Naomi leaned back, the power in the room entirely hers. "But thank you for the offer," she said smoothly. "Truly." Richard exhaled, trying to salvage something. "At least let's keep the door open. If you ever need—" Naomi stood. "Richard, I don't leave doors open for people who laughed at me." She turned to Marcus. "We're done here." Marcus gave a slight nod, standing as well. Jason and Lydia followed. As Naomi walked out of that boardroom, out of that building, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about winning. This was about making sure they never forgot the day they realized they had underestimated her. Naomi stepped out of Dalton Enterprises for the last time, the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders. She had walked into that boardroom months ago, hoping for a chance. Now, she was walking away, knowing she didn't need one. The sun had begun to set, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of gold and crimson. Naomi inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. There was no need to celebrate just yet. She had work to do. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "How'd it go?" Marcus's voice asked the moment she answered. She smiled, unlocking her car and sliding into the driver's seat. "Exactly how I wanted it to." Marcus chuckled. "So they really thought we'd take their money?" "They thought we needed it," she corrected, fastening her seatbelt. "Big difference?" He hummed in approval. "Well, I just got off the phone with one of our newest clients, Fortis Bank. They want to double their investment in our AI integration. Their test results are through the roof." Naomi let out a small laugh. "And to think, some people thought this wasn't a viable business." "Funny how that works," Marcus said. As they spoke, she drove through the city, passing the towering buildings that once felt unreachable. The billboards, the corporate offices, the polished glass walls. This world wasn't built for people like her. But she had forced her way in. By the time she arrived at Innotech headquarters, the office was still buzzing with energy. Her team worked late because they wanted to, not because they had to. There was a drive in all of them, a hunger to build something that lasted. She walked through the open concept workspace, exchanging nods and smiles with her employees. These were the people who had believed in her from the start, the engineers, the sales reps, the assistants who had worked out of coffee shops when they had no real office to call their own. She stepped into her corner office, placing her bag on the desk. The view stretched far, overlooking the city skyline. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text. "Richard Dalton, if you change your mind, let's talk. We'd still love to be involved." Naomi stared at the message for a moment before locking her phone and tossing it onto the desk. Some people didn't learn. A knock on the door pulled her attention away. Jason stepped inside, tablet in hand. "Got a minute?" "Always." He sat across from her, swiping through a few reports. "We just finished the final phase of beta testing for the enterprise AI model. It's ready for launch." Naomi leaned forward, intrigued. "Final numbers?" Jason turned the tablet around so she could see. The performance graphs soared, customer satisfaction ratings hitting record highs. It was beyond what they had predicted. She exhaled, a slow smile forming. "This is it." Jason nodded. "This is it." There was a moment of silence, the gravity of what they had built sinking in. "Go ahead with the press release," she said finally, "and let's start prepping for the global rollout. I want every major outlet covering this." Jason grinned. "Already ahead of you." As he left the office, Naomi let herself lean back in her chair, closing her eyes for just a second. She had spent years fighting for a seat at the table. Now, she was building her own. And the world was paying attention. The next morning, the news broke. Innotech announces global expansion following record-breaking AI integration success. The headlines were everywhere. Business publications, tech blogs, major financial networks. Investors were scrambling. Companies were reaching out. The same people who once ignored her were now desperate to get in. By noon, her inbox was flooded with partnership requests. By evening, her name was trending. And by the end of the week, one thing was clear. Innotech wasn't just a success. It was a revolution. Months later, Naomi found herself sitting in a familiar high-rise restaurant, only this time, she wasn't there for approval. She was there to meet a potential client, one of the biggest telecom companies in the world. As she waited, sipping a glass of wine, she noticed a figure at the bar. Richard Dalton. He was sitting alone, a drink in hand, staring at his phone with a look of quiet frustration. Naomi simply smiled to herself, shaking her head. Some people laughed too soon, and some people never saw it coming.